On the evening of September 19th, 1983, a transaction occurred at a Burger King drive-through window in Falls Church, Virginia, that would unravel a Soviet intelligence operation that had been running successfully for nearly 3 years. The restaurant sat just off Route 7, a major commuter corridor linking downtown Washington, D.C. to the sprawling residential communities of Northern Virginia. And during evening rush hours between 5:30 and 7 p.m., it served a steady stream of government workers, military personnel, and defense contractors making their way home after long days at offices scattered throughout the region. The location was wedged between a Shell gas station and a small strip mall containing a dry cleaner, a pharmacy, and a tax preparation service. But what was happening there, conducted through the narrow window where customers collected their orders, was anything but ordinary. James Riley was 19 years old and had been working the drive-through window at the Burger King for approximately 7 months. His responsibilities included taking orders through the speaker system, collecting payment at the window, and handing customers their food along with correct change. It was repetitive work, the kind that allowed his mind to wander during slower periods. But during the evening rush, the pace was relentless enough that he operated almost entirely on autopilot. Orders blurred together. Voices through the speaker became indistinguishable, and the parade of vehicles pulling up to his window formed an endless sequence of makes, models, and colors that he rarely bothered to remember once they drove away. On the evening of September 19th, sometime around 6:45 p.m., approximately 27 minutes before the typical end of the rush period, a blue sedan pulled up to the drive-through window. The driver was a man, middle-aged, perhaps in his early to mid-40s, wearing glasses and what appeared to be a dark suit or sport coat. He ordered only a small coffee, no food, which struck Riley as slightly unusual since most customers during the dinner rush ordered complete meals. But it wasn't unusual enough to warrant much attention. People stopped for coffee all the time, particularly commuters who faced long drives home and needed something to keep them alert. Riley rang up the order, informed the customer the total was 85 cents, and waited at the window while the man reached for his wallet. The customer handed him a $5 bill, and Riley accepted it, turning to the register to make change. It was only after the customer had driven away and Riley was organizing the bills in the cash drawer that he noticed something odd. The $5 bill had been folded around something else, a piece of paper that had been tucked inside the fold and was now sitting on the counter next to the register. Riley picked it up and unfolded it carefully. It was approximately 3 inches by 4 inches, white paper, and covered with typed text. Columns of numbers and letters arranged in rows, what appeared to be some kind of code or reference system, though Riley had no idea what it might mean or what purpose it served. His first assumption was that the customer had accidentally given him the wrong bill, that the paper had been tucked inside for safekeeping, and the man simply hadn't noticed it was there when he pulled the money from his wallet. It seemed like the most logical explanation. Riley placed the paper in the small lost and found box that the restaurant kept behind the counter for items customers left behind, figuring that if the man realized his mistake, he would return to claim it. The rest of Riley's shift passed without incident, and when he clocked out at 9 p.m., he mentioned the odd occurrence to the closing manager, describing the folded bill in the paper with the typed codes. The manager shrugged and suggested that if no one claimed it within a week, they would throw it away. Riley drove home to the apartment he shared with 2 roommates, both also students at Northern Virginia Community College, and thought nothing more about the blue sedan or the mysterious piece of paper that had been folded inside a $5 bill. 2 weeks later, on October 3rd, at approximately 6:47 p.m., the blue sedan returned. Riley was working the same evening shift, and the moment the vehicle pulled up to the window, something in his memory triggered recognition. It was the same car, he was nearly certain, the same shade of blue, the same model, though he couldn't have said with confidence what make it was. When the driver leaned toward the window to place his order, Riley saw the same middle-aged man wearing glasses, and the order was identical to the first visit. A small coffee, nothing else. This time, Riley paid closer attention. He rang up the order, stated the total, and watched as the customer reached for his wallet with hands that seemed to be shaking slightly, a tremor that could have been nervousness or simply the natural unsteadiness that some people experienced. The man handed him a $5 bill, and Riley accepted it with deliberate care, immediately noticing that it felt thicker than normal, as if something had been folded inside. After the sedan drove away, Riley unfolded the bill and found another piece of paper, nearly identical in size to the first, covered with the same type of typed text. Columns of numbers and letters arranged in neat rows, what appeared to be coded information of some kind, though the meaning remained completely opaque to him. This time, Riley did not assume it was an accident. The repetition was too precise, the pattern too deliberate. The same vehicle, the same customer, the same order, the same method of payment with a folded paper hidden inside. Someone was intentionally passing these coded documents through the drive-through window, and Riley had been selected, whether by chance or design, as the recipient. The third occurrence happened on October 17th at 6:43 p.m., and by then Riley was certain he was witnessing something that went beyond coincidence or accident. He had been watching for the blue sedan during his shifts, particularly during the early evening hours when the first two visits had occurred, and when it appeared again, he felt a surge of validation mixed with growing unease. The exchange unfolded exactly as before. Small coffee, $5 bill, folded paper hidden inside. Riley retrieved the paper after the customer drove away and examined it more carefully this time, holding it up to the fluorescent lights above the drive-through station. The typing was professional, done on what appeared to be a standard typewriter, and the codes themselves suggested some kind of reference system, possibly related to documents or files or inventory, though without context, interpretation was impossible. Riley discussed the situation with a coworker named Marcus Chen during their shared break that evening. Marcus was 20 years old, an engineering student at George Mason University, who worked the drive-through station on alternating shifts with Riley, and he listened to the description of the three exchanges with increasing interest. Marcus suggested several possibilities. It could be related to illegal gambling, with the codes representing bets or payouts. It could be connected to drug distribution, with the papers containing delivery instructions or transaction records. Or it could be something else entirely, something neither of them had the experience or knowledge to identify. What seemed clear was that whatever was happening, it was deliberate, organized, and almost certainly illegal. The fourth occurrence took place on October 24th, and this time both Riley and Marcus were working. They had discussed a plan during the days leading up to the exchange, assuming it would follow the established pattern of occurring approximately every 2 weeks. When the blue sedan appeared at 6:51 p.m., Riley took the order as usual, while Marcus positioned himself in the food preparation area, where he had a clear line of sight to the drive-through window. The exchange proceeded without variation. Small coffee, $5 bill, folded paper. But this time, before placing the paper in the lost and found box with the others, Riley brought it to the back area where Marcus was waiting with a Polaroid camera he had brought from home. They photographed the paper carefully, making sure the typed text was legible in the image, then placed both the original paper and the photograph in a manila envelope that Marcus locked in his car. The photograph showed the coded text clearly, columns of letters and numbers arranged in what appeared to be official document format, typed with the precision of someone accustomed to handling sensitive materials. The decision about what to do with that information would prove more complicated than either young man anticipated. Over the next week, Riley and Marcus discussed what they should do with the information they had gathered. They met twice at Marcus's apartment, spreading the 4 coded papers across his kitchen table and examining them under the overhead light, searching for patterns or meanings that might help them understand what they were looking at. The papers all shared the same format, typed text arranged in neat columns, but the specific codes changed from one paper to the next, suggesting they represented different pieces of information rather than repetitions of the same message. Marcus had taken it upon himself to research espionage cases at the Fairfax County Library, checking out books about Cold War intelligence operations and reading accounts of how Soviet spies operated in the United States. What he found made both young men increasingly convinced that what they had stumbled upon was not drug dealing or illegal gambling, but something far more serious. They decided they needed to document everything before reporting what they had found. If this was genuine espionage, they would need evidence that went beyond 4 pieces of paper and a single Polaroid photograph. They needed to observe what happened after the exchange, to see whether the blue sedan met with another vehicle or person, to establish that this was part of a larger operation rather than simply an eccentric individual passing meaningless codes through a fast food window. On November 7th at 6:41 p.m., when the blue sedan appeared for the 5th time, they were ready to execute their plan. Riley took the order as he had during the previous 4 exchanges, accepting the $5 bill and retrieving the folded paper from inside. Meanwhile, Marcus had positioned himself outside the restaurant, standing near the edge of the building with a cigarette he did not actually smoke, pretending to be on break while keeping his attention focused on the blue sedan. The sedan did not leave the Burger King immediately after collecting the coffee. Instead, the driver pulled into a parking space in the far corner of the lot, away from the entrance and the main flow of traffic, and remained there with the engine running. Marcus watched from his position near the building, trying to appear casual while tracking the sedan's position. Approximately 8 minutes passed before a second vehicle, a white Toyota sedan, pulled into the lot and parked directly next to the blue car. The driver of the Toyota leaned toward the passenger window, and the driver of the blue sedan leaned toward his own passenger window, and for approximately 30 seconds, the two engaged in what appeared to be a brief conversation or exchange. Marcus could not see clearly enough to determine whether anything physical was passed between the vehicles, but the interaction was deliberate and appeared coordinated. Both vehicles left the parking lot separately, the white Toyota departing first and turning south on Route 7, followed 2 minutes later by the blue sedan, which turned north. Marcus walked quickly back into the restaurant and found Riley at the drive-through window. He described what he had witnessed, and the two stood in the back area during a brief lull in customer traffic, processing what the observation meant. The pattern was now undeniable. The man in the blue sedan was passing information through the drive-through window, then meeting with a second person in the parking lot to complete some kind of handoff or verification. This was not the behavior of someone engaged in petty crime. This was operational security, the kind of careful coordination that suggested professional intelligence work. That evening, Marcus called his father from his apartment. His father worked as a mid-level administrator at the Department of Commerce in Washington and held a security clearance that required periodic briefings on counterintelligence matters. Marcus explained the situation carefully, describing the repeated exchanges, the coded papers, the meeting in the parking lot between two vehicles. His father listened without interruption, and when Marcus finished, there was a long pause on the line before his father spoke. He told Marcus that he needed to contact the FBI immediately, that what he and Riley had witnessed was almost certainly espionage, and that every day they delayed reporting it was another day that classified information might be passing to a foreign intelligence service. He gave Marcus the phone number for the FBI Washington field office and told him to call first thing in the morning. On November 14th, before making that call, the blue sedan appeared one final time. It was the sixth exchange, and it followed the established pattern exactly. Small coffee, $5 bill, folded paper. But this time, Riley decided to attempt conversation, something he had avoided during the previous 5 visits out of fear of disrupting the pattern or alerting the customer to the fact that he had been noticed. As he handed the coffee through the window and accepted the $5 bill, Riley offered a casual comment about the weather. "Cold out today," he said. "Coffee's perfect for weather like this." The customer responded with a brief acknowledgement, his voice controlled and even, and Riley detected what he would later describe as a slight accent, possibly Eastern European, though he had no expertise in identifying such things. As the blue sedan drove away, Riley noticed details he had not paid attention to during earlier visits. The customer's hands had been clean and well-maintained, suggesting office work rather than manual labor. He wore no wedding ring. His watch appeared expensive, the kind that someone with a professional salary might own. These observations, combined with the 5 coded papers now in their possession and the witnessed meeting with the white Toyota, formed a body of evidence that Riley and Marcus believed was substantial enough to present to federal authorities. On the morning of November 16th, Riley placed the call to the FBI Washington field office from a payphone outside his apartment building. The agent who answered took his name and asked him to describe the nature of his report. Riley explained that he worked at a Burger King in Falls Church and had witnessed what he believed was espionage being conducted through the drive-through window. There was a brief pause on the line, and Riley could sense skepticism in the silence. Stories about spy operations discovered by fast food employees were presumably not the kind of leads that typically resulted in serious investigations. But when Riley mentioned the coded papers, the repeated pattern over multiple weeks, the coordination with a second vehicle in the parking lot, and the partial license plate number Marcus had managed to record, the tone of the conversation shifted noticeably. The agent asked several follow-up questions about dates, times, and the physical description of the man in the blue sedan. Then he told Riley that someone from the counterintelligence division would contact him within 24 hours to arrange a meeting. The call came the following morning. An agent identifying himself as Raymond Kozak requested that Riley and Marcus come to the field office in downtown Washington that afternoon, if their schedules permitted. Both young men called in sick to work and took the metro into the city, arriving at the Federal Building on 4th Street shortly before 2 p.m. They were escorted to a conference room on an upper floor where Kozak was waiting. A man in his late 40s with gray hair and the controlled demeanor of someone who had spent years conducting interviews and evaluating information. He asked them to describe everything they had observed, starting from the first occurrence on September 19th and proceeding chronologically through each subsequent exchange. Riley did most of the talking while Marcus supplemented with details about the parking lot observation and the second vehicle. When they finished their account, Kozak asked to see the evidence they had collected. Riley produced the manila envelope containing the 5 coded papers and the Polaroid photograph. Kozak examined each paper carefully, holding them up to the light and studying the typed text without comment. He asked whether anyone else had touched the papers or knew about what Riley and Marcus had discovered. They assured him that aside from Marcus's father, who had advised them to contact the FBI, they had told no one. Kozak placed the papers in a clear plastic evidence bag, labeled it with case information, and told them the materials would be sent to the FBI laboratory for analysis, and then forwarded to the Bureau's cryptanalysis specialists. He explained that the process might take several days, possibly longer, and that they should not discuss what they had reported with anyone, including their co-workers at the Burger King. The confirmation arrived 6 days later. Kozak called Riley at home on November 23rd and asked him to return to the field office the following morning. When Riley and Marcus arrived, Kozak informed them that the papers had been analyzed and the results were significant. The codes on the papers matched formats used in known Soviet intelligence communications, and more specifically, the reference numbers corresponded to classified documents from Department of Defense procurement systems. The information suggested that someone with access to sensitive defense materials was photographing or copying those materials and encoding the reference numbers before passing them through an intermediary. What Riley had stumbled upon was not a low-level operation or a misunderstanding. It was active espionage, and it had likely been running successfully for an extended period before the first paper arrived at the Burger King drive-through window in September. Kozak explained that the FBI would be establishing a surveillance operation at the restaurant. The goal was to identify the man in the blue sedan, confirm his connection to classified information, and determine the identity of the person driving the white Toyota who appeared to be serving as his handler. Undercover agents would be positioned inside the Burger King posing as customers during the time window when the exchanges had previously occurred, which, based on Riley's documentation, was between 6:30 and 7 p.m. on Monday evenings, approximately every 2 weeks. Additional agents would be stationed in vehicles outside with clear sight lines to both the drive-through window and the parking lot. The operation would begin immediately, with coverage starting November 28th and continuing every Monday and Thursday evening until the subject returned. The first week of surveillance produced no results. The blue sedan did not appear, and Kozak's team began to consider the possibility that the subject had been spooked by some detail they had not accounted for, or that the operational schedule had changed in ways they could not predict. The second week passed similarly, with agents rotating through shifts at the Burger King and maintaining watch over the parking lot, but observing nothing beyond ordinary customer traffic. By the start of the third week, there was discussion within the task force about whether the operation had been compromised. But Kozak believed there was still value in maintaining surveillance, arguing that intelligence assets often went dormant for periods before resuming activity, and that the pattern Riley had documented suggested a disciplined operative who might simply be waiting for the appropriate moment to re-establish contact. On December 5th at 6:39 p.m., the blue sedan returned. FBI surveillance teams positioned inside the restaurant and in vehicles outside immediately transmitted confirmation through their communication network. The driver proceeded through the pattern exactly as Riley had described in his statement. He ordered a small coffee, pulled up to the window, and handed the payment to Riley, who by prearrangement was working that evening. FBI photographers in an unmarked van across Route 7 captured clear images of the driver through telephoto lenses, documenting his face, his vehicle, and the license plate number in full. After collecting his coffee, the driver pulled out of the Burger King lot and turned north on Route 7. 2 FBI vehicles immediately established mobile surveillance, following at a careful distance as the sedan proceeded through evening traffic toward McLean, a distance of approximately 8 miles. The sedan eventually turned into an apartment complex on McGarrity Road, and agents observed the driver park and enter a specific building. The license plate was run through Virginia Department of Motor Vehicles records within minutes, and the registration came back to a Robert K. Morrison, age 41, with an address matching the apartment complex where the surveillance team had just watched him enter. Background checks on Robert Morrison revealed information that transformed the investigation from promising to urgent. Morrison was employed by TRW Systems Group, a defense contractor that held classified contracts with the Department of Defense relating to satellite communications and reconnaissance technology. His security clearance level was top secret, granting him access to technical specifications, encryption protocols, and personnel information related to sensitive national security programs. Financial records showed no obvious irregularities that might have flagged him during routine security reviews. No large unexplained deposits, no excessive debt, no unusual spending patterns. His personnel file at TRW indicated he had been with the company since 1979 and had received consistently positive performance evaluations. On paper, Morrison appeared to be exactly the kind of reliable mid-level technical analyst that defense contractors depended on to keep classified programs running smoothly and securely. Surveillance of Morrison's apartment began immediately, with agents maintaining 24-hour observation in rotating shifts. His phone records were subpoenaed and analyzed, revealing no suspicious international calls or contacts with known foreign intelligence operatives. His movements were tracked and documented. He left for work each morning at approximately 7:15 a.m., arrived at the TRW facility in Reston by 8:00 a.m., and typically remained there until 5:30 or 6 p.m. His evenings were spent at home, with occasional trips to a grocery store or a restaurant. The pattern was mundane and unremarkable, the daily routine of a single professional living alone in Northern Virginia. But Kozak's assessment, based on the coded papers and the established pattern of dead drops, was that Morrison had been transferring classified information for an extended period, and that the drive-through method represented a refinement of tradecraft rather than a beginning. The FBI coordinated with TRW's security division to install additional surveillance cameras in areas where Morrison worked, a measure implemented quietly to avoid alerting him to the investigation. On December 19th, those cameras captured Morrison photographing documents at his workstation using a small camera concealed in what appeared to be a calculator case. The images were clear enough to show him positioning papers under his desk lamp and pressing the shutter multiple times before returning the documents to their proper files. This provided direct evidence of the theft, but Kozak made the decision to allow the operation to continue rather than making an immediate arrest. The goal was to identify Morrison's handler definitively and determine whether there were other individuals in his network before shutting the entire operation down. Intelligence analysis of Morrison's pattern suggested the next dead drop would occur on January 9, 1984, based on the roughly 2-week intervals documented by Riley and confirmed through subsequent surveillance. The FBI prepared extensively for what they anticipated would be the final exchange before arrests were made. 8 agents were deployed around the Burger King in various capacities. 2 were positioned inside the restaurant as customers, seated at tables with clear views of the drive-through window. 4 additional agents were stationed in unmarked vehicles in the parking lot and along Route 7, positioned to provide coverage of all possible exit routes. Communication equipment linked all surveillance positions, and Kozak monitored the operation from a van parked across the highway with direct sight lines to both the drive-through and the lot where Morrison had previously met with the white Toyota. At 6:34 p.m., Morrison's blue sedan pulled into the drive-through lane. FBI photographers documented his arrival, capturing images as he ordered his coffee and pulled forward to the window where Riley was working. The exchange occurred exactly as it had during previous observations. Morrison handed Riley a $5 bill, accepted his coffee and change, and drove away from the window. He proceeded to the far corner of the parking lot and pulled into a space away from other vehicles, leaving his engine running. Agents watching through binoculars noted that Morrison appeared calm, showing none of the nervousness or agitation that might indicate he suspected surveillance. At 6:41 p.m., precisely 7 minutes after Morrison had parked, A white Toyota sedan entered the lot and pulled into the space directly beside Morrison's vehicle. The driver was a woman, approximately 35 to 40 years old with dark hair, and FBI photographers captured clear images of her face through telephoto lenses as she leaned toward her passenger window. Morrison leaned toward his own passenger window, and for 43 seconds by FBI count, the two appeared to engage in conversation or conduct an exchange. The agents could not determine from their positions whether any physical items were passed between the vehicles, but the coordination and timing suggested this was the handler pickup that Riley and Marcus had observed during their initial documentation in November. The white Toyota left the parking lot first, turning south on Route 7. Two FBI vehicles immediately established mobile surveillance while maintaining communication with the teams watching Morrison. 90 seconds later, Morrison's sedan exited the lot and turned north, followed by two additional FBI vehicles. The simultaneous tail operations proceeded through evening traffic with both subjects apparently unaware they were being followed. The white Toyota was tracked to a residential neighborhood in Arlington, where the driver pulled into the driveway of a townhouse on North Fillmore Street. Agents observed her exit the vehicle and enter the residence. Morrison was followed to his apartment complex in McLean, where he parked and went inside at 7:12 p.m. Coordinated arrest warrants and search warrants had been prepared in advance and were executed simultaneously at both locations. At 7:18 p.m., FBI agents approached the Arlington townhouse and arrested the woman as she answered the door. She identified herself as Elena Volkov and immediately claimed diplomatic immunity, stating she was a cultural attaché with the Soviet embassy. At the same moment, agents entered Morrison's apartment and took him into custody without resistance. Search teams immediately began systematic documentation and collection of evidence at both residences and in both vehicles. At Morrison's apartment, agents found camera equipment including the device he had used to photograph documents at his workplace, 4 rolls of undeveloped film, approximately $12,000 in cash stored in a floor safe, and handwritten notes containing what appeared to be contact instructions, and a schedule of dates extending back to May 1982. In Volkov's townhouse, agents recovered a diplomatic passport, communication equipment including a radio transmitter, multiple sets of identification documents, and papers containing the same coding system that had appeared on the materials passed through the Burger King drive-through window. Morrison was transported to the FBI field office in Washington and placed in an interrogation room where he remained silent for the first 36 hours, invoking his right to legal counsel and refusing to answer questions about his activities or his relationship with Elena Volkov. But as the evidence was methodically presented to him over the following days, documented in photographs and witness statements and technical analysis reports, his resolve began to weaken. After consulting with a public defender and being informed of the potential sentences he faced under federal espionage statutes, which could include life imprisonment, Morrison agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for consideration during sentencing. What he told the FBI during interrogation sessions conducted between January 10th and January 15th, 1984, provided confirmation of the investigation's findings and filled in details that surveillance alone could not have captured. Morrison admitted he had been photographing classified materials for approximately 18 months, beginning in May 1982, using camera equipment that Volkov had provided. His motivation had been entirely financial. He had accumulated significant gambling debts, nearly $40,000 owed to bookmakers in the Washington area, and had been facing increasingly aggressive collection efforts that included threats of physical harm. Volkov had approached him at an industry conference in Crystal City in March 1982, striking up a conversation that seemed casual at first, but gradually became more pointed. She had demonstrated knowledge of his financial situation, information she could only have obtained through careful research or surveillance, and she had offered him a solution. In exchange for copies of certain technical documents he accessed through his work at TRW, she would pay him amounts that started at $2,000 per exchange and eventually increased to $4,000. Morrison claimed he had initially resisted, but the combination of his desperate financial circumstances and Volkov's assurances that the information he would provide was relatively harmless, consisting primarily of technical specifications that the Soviets would eventually obtain through other means, had convinced him to accept. The first exchanges had been conducted through different methods that Morrison described as more traditional dead drops, involving parks and shopping centers where materials were left in predetermined locations. The drive-through system had been implemented in September 1982 after Volkov determined that their previous methods carried too much risk of observation by law enforcement or counterintelligence operatives. The Burger King location had been selected because of its high traffic volume, its position on a major commuter route, and the fact that brief transactions at a drive-through window appeared entirely normal and would be difficult to distinguish from legitimate customer interactions. Morrison stated that he had never known Volkov's real identity or background beyond the cover story she had provided about being a trade representative. He had no knowledge of other assets in her network, no information about Soviet intelligence operations beyond his own involvement. Volkov had compartmentalized her operations professionally, ensuring that if one asset was compromised, the damage would be contained. The Department of Defense and TRW Systems Group conducted a joint damage assessment to determine what classified information Morrison had accessed and passed to Volkov during the 18 months he had been operating. The assessment, portions of which remained classified decades, later concluded that Morrison had provided information on satellite communication frequencies, encryption algorithms used in secure military communications, technical specifications for reconnaissance satellite hardware, and lists of contractor personnel who held security clearances and might be vulnerable to recruitment. The information had given Soviet intelligence services potential capabilities to intercept communications, identify additional targets for recruitment operations, and understand technical limitations of American satellite systems. The damage was classified as significant but contained, meaning that while strategic advantages had been compromised, there was no evidence the information had led directly to loss of life or catastrophic failure of intelligence operations. Elena Volkov was expelled from the United States on January 12, 1984, declared persona non grata by the State Department based on her intelligence activities. Her diplomatic status prevented prosecution, and she was escorted to Dulles International Airport by FBI agents and placed on a flight to Moscow. According to declassified CIA reports that became available in the late 1990s, Volkov was confirmed to be a GRU officer, a member of Soviet military intelligence rather than the KGB, and she continued intelligence work in Eastern Europe through the remainder of the Cold War, until the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Morrison was charged with multiple counts of espionage, unauthorized disclosure of classified information to a foreign power, and conspiracy. His trial proceeded through the federal court system over the following months, with much of the evidence presented in closed sessions due to classification concerns. On February 28, 1984, Morrison entered a guilty plea in exchange for a reduced sentence and his continued cooperation with counterintelligence investigators attempting to identify other potential compromises within the defense contractor community. On March 15th, he appeared before a federal judge in the Eastern District of Virginia for sentencing. His attorney argued for leniency based on his cooperation and the financial desperation that had motivated his crimes. federal prosecutors countered that Morrison had been paid approximately $85,000 over 18 months for betraying classified information, that his actions had been calculated and sustained rather than impulsive, and that the damage to national security had been substantial. The judge sentenced Morrison to 25 years in federal prison, noting that while his cooperation had been valuable, the severity of his crimes and the extended period over which he had operated as a Soviet asset warranted significant punishment. James Riley and Marcus Chen were formally commended by the FBI director in letters sent to both young men in March 1984. They each received $5,000 from a government program that provided financial rewards to civilian informants whose information led to successful counterintelligence operations. Riley continued working at the Burger King for another 14 months before enlisting in the United States Navy in May 1985, following the example of an uncle who had served during the Vietnam era. Marcus completed his engineering degree at George Mason University and was subsequently hired by a defense contractor, where his background check and security clearance process were expedited based on his role in the Morrison case. Both men were interviewed multiple times over subsequent years for FBI training materials on the importance of civilian vigilance and the role ordinary citizens could play in identifying suspicious activities that might indicate espionage or other national security threats. The Burger King location on Route 7 in Falls Church remained operational until 1999, when it was closed during a corporate restructuring. The building was eventually demolished and replaced by a CVS pharmacy. The story of the drive-through espionage operation remained classified for years, with only limited details becoming public after partial declassification in 1997. In a 1995 interview conducted after his retirement from the FBI, Raymond Kozak reflected on the Morrison case and its implications. He noted that the drive-through dead drop had been a brilliant example of tradecraft, hiding intelligence exchanges in plain sight within the routine transactions of everyday life. He emphasized that without Riley's attention to detail and his willingness to report something that seemed unusual, Morrison might have continued operating for years longer, passing classified information to Soviet intelligence while maintaining the appearance of a loyal and trustworthy employee. The Morrison case, Kozak observed, demonstrated that sophisticated intelligence operations could function invisibly in even the most heavily surveilled areas of the United States, and that the most effective defense against such operations was not always advanced technology or elaborate counterintelligence protocols, but rather ordinary citizens who noticed patterns that did not fit and took the time to report them to appropriate authorities. The blue sedan never returned to that Burger King, but the 6 pieces of paper that had been passed through its drive-through window had exposed an operation that had, until that September evening, functioned invisibly in one of the most heavily surveilled areas of the United States.